Hello, we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 6 today. We will not finish Ephesians today. Lord willing, next week we will finish Ephesians. I know there's a lot of concern about when are we going to come back, when are we going to start meeting again. To answer that question the best that I can, I will just say now for those of you in our Salem Creek family, just have your phone nearby because sometime within the following few days, an elder should be calling you, letting you know what the game plan is. I will go ahead and say that for the time being now, even if we are meeting live on Sundays, we will not be meeting live on Wednesday nights for the foreseeable future. That being said, I will continue to bring these Bible class lessons to you via YouTube and here in my office. And so with that, let's jump back into Ephesians. I want to say one thing about Ephesians chapter 5 before we move on to chapter 6 with this context of wives and husbands. One thing I had written down, but of course as you get going in Bible study, you forget certain things. And so let me go back and talk about Ephesians 5, verse 22 through, 30-something, 33? Yep. Okay. Wives and husbands. The command for wives is to be to their husbands as to the Lord. Now, your Bible will say, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. As we mentioned last week, this verse has no verb in Greek. When there's no verb in Greek, you usually supply the verb to be. So it would be something like is, be, was, whatever fits the context here. So if we're reading it literally, it would say, wives, be to your own husbands as to the Lord. And so in the same way that we do honor and glorify the Lord and do submit to the Lord, we are doing that to our husbands if we are a wife. Now, that really doesn't go against anything in the first century. The historical context of this passage is very difficult to understand because wives were often considered as property. During this time, free women were able to have certain rights. They could own land, they could divorce their husbands, they had certain rights, but not very many if you were outside of this governmental status. Husbands, on the other hand, when Paul writes to husbands, he is turning their social context upside down. Paul says in verse 25, husbands, love your wives. That turns this context upside down because husbands rarely married for love. Marriages in the first century were rarely done out of love at all. So what you get is you get a man and a woman marrying to join businesses together, to unite families, to gain land, to gain wealth, something like that. And the husband, because the wife was considered as property, and she never was, according to that context, considered part of her husband's family. She was always considered to be part of her father's family. Because of that, Paul just turns the world upside down when he says, husbands, love your wives. Because there was no love, really. A husband could go out and he could have a sexual relationship with whomever he wanted, especially here in Ephesus. Again, said it a million times, the letter to the Ephesians is not written only to the Ephesians, but it was, I believe, written to the Ephesians as one of several congregations. You worship in Ephesus by having a sexual relationship with temple prostitutes. And so the relationships between a husband and wife had nothing to do with love. But so Paul says, husbands, love your wives in the same way Christ loved the church, and wives, honor and submit to your husbands, be to your husbands the same way that you are to Christ. So if you want to understand what a marriage should look like, look at the ultimate ideal for Christ and the church. And this is why I believe the church is called the bride of Christ in John's Revelation. Just wanted to mention that before we move on. Now we move on to chapter 6. Unfortunately, this seems to begin a new context. It doesn't. It goes right on the tail end of husbands and wives. And we're going to talk about children and parents, and then slaves and masters. We'll have more to say about slaves and masters, as I said last week, when we get to Paul's letter to Philemon. So I am going to give you some contextual information here, but we'll get to that when we get there. Let's talk first about children. Chapter 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, Paul is going to reference the fifth commandment. Honor your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Paul is writing to a Gentile audience. It does not seem likely that the majority of Paul's audience would have known specifically this commandment. An argument could be made that when Paul is evangelizing, of course, Paul stayed in Ephesus for 2 years, so when Paul is evangelizing there in Ephesus, the argument could be made that he used the Old Testament Scriptures, which of course he did. He had to use the Old Testament Scriptures to teach Jesus. So where do you start with the Old Testament Scriptures? Some may say, well, you have to start at the beginning with Genesis and creation and all of that. I wonder if Paul didn't start with the Ten Commandments. And from the Ten Commandments say, here are the two greatest commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor. And from that, introduce Jesus and how Jesus is truly God and truly human. And to show that how Jesus' relationship with God is, so ours now can be in Him, and to show how Jesus' relationship with His fellow man was, that's what ours needs to be as well. I wonder if that would have happened. I don't know. I know that Paul usually began preaching in the synagogues, which would have well known the Old Testament Scriptures, of course. And so regardless of whether Paul's audience here is Gentilic or Jewish or whatever, they, I think, as a congregation of Christians, are going to well know this particular verse. The Bible has a lot to say about the relationship between parent and child. Most of the time, it is the burden of the child to show honor and respect to the parent. As a matter of fact, in the Old Covenant, if a child did not honor and respect his parents and did certain things to cause dishonor, that child could lose his or her life. So Paul says, this is why this is the first command with a promise. Children, he says, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. In the same way that the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, and this is the fifth commandment, says to obey your parents, he says to honor your father and your mother. That is the commandment, to honor your father and mother. But notice what Paul does in these 4 little verses. He tells them why, first of all, you must honor your father and mother. He says this is the first commandment with a promise, and the promise is simply this, that you may live long in the land, that it may go well with you and you will live long in the land. We have often attributed this to say if you honor your father and your mother, then God will bless you with a long life. I don't believe that that is what the original author, Moses, and the lawgiver, God, had in mind when they wrote this, because the penalty for not doing this command, for disobeying this command, was death. And so, if you obey the command, you will live long, because you won't have an early death. If you don't obey the command, you're going to receive an early death. I think that's what Paul's getting to here, that the promise is for your prolonging of life. And in the same way that God is going to make sure that you have a prolonged life in the Old Testament with the Ten Commandments, God is also saying, if you will obey me, if you will submit to your parents, if you will keep to the moral code, then there will be less reason for you to have an untimely, let's call it, death. If you do this, you won't be put to death by the government. If you do this, you won't be murdered by your neighbor because you're obeying these moral codes. Now, Paul does something here that is characteristic of Paul, and it's something that I think a lot of preachers try to do, but perhaps we try to do it too much. And that is, Paul is going to flip the script, if you will. He's been addressing children. He's been addressing wives and husbands. But now he's going to address the fathers. Now, why does he address the fathers and not the mothers? Friends, one of the most difficult things that I get to do in ministry and with bringing sermons is preaching holidays, because you have those people who would get very upset with you if you did not preach a topic of the holiday. Then you have other people who get very upset with you if you do not. So it's a double-edged sword, and we have to be very careful. One of those holidays is Mother's Day. I just recently preached a sermon on Mother's Day, and as I began to think about what I was going to do for Mother's Day, it hit me very quickly that very little is said in the Bible about specific examples of mothers. Of course, you have, for example, Moses' mother, you have Hannah, you have Mary, the mother of Jesus. I'm not saying we don't have good examples of mothers in the Bible, and you also have bad examples of mothers in the Bible. Peninnah in 1 Samuel chapter 1 is an example. She's the rival of Hannah. She has children, but she treats Hannah just so horribly because Hannah doesn't have children. Why is it, though, that we can look in the Bible and see so much about fathers and not very much about mothers? Well, we have to think about the context and the time that the Bible was written, of course, spanning thousands of years. But from the beginning to the end of the Bible in its context, it is a patriarchal-driven society. I believe that were society a matriarchal-driven society, we would probably refer to God as our mother. We would probably have more Mother's Day lessons than Father's Day lessons. But that is not the way the culture was designed. And I think that comes from the fall in Genesis 3, where Eve is going to be subservient. She is going to be submissive to her husband, Adam. So all of that being said, and let me say one more thing before I move on. I'm getting kind of off topic, but this is important because I know some of you are going to text me or call me or email me about this. I'm not suggesting God is a woman when I say that if it was a matriarchal society that we would refer to God as our mother. God is spirit. We attribute gender to God because the context and culture in which these authors lived attribute gender to authority. I believe there are two genders. Okay? Just two, male and female. God does not have an XX or an XY chromosome. God is spirit. He is genderless. But we refer to him, and there I use the pronoun him, because of the authority that comes with a patriarchal masculine pronoun. Further, all throughout the Bible, God is only used in reference to the masculine. So you have the masculine pronoun, you have masculine titles for God, all of that there. So don't misunderstand me on this, okay? So you come to verse 4, it says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord." What does that mean? And why don't we address mothers? Well, we don't address mothers because the mothers didn't really have anything to do with the discipline of the children. Let me show you what would have happened or let me tell you, I suppose, what would have happened in the first century during this time. Let's say that Kayla and I live in the first century. Let's say that Kayla becomes pregnant and there are no ultrasounds. You don't know if you're going to have a boy or a girl. And you don't know if that child is going to be healthy or unhealthy or have deformities or whatever. So, in the first century, we come 9 months down the road. Kayla gives birth to a baby boy, let's just say, for sake of argument. And that baby boy was born without an arm. I, as the father, have the right, unfortunately I have to put it in those terms, I have the right to accept or deny that child as my son. If I accept that child, then I will raise the child as my own. My child will have an inheritance of mine. But if I don't, and this is shown by the nurse would come in and present the child to the father. The father could either pick up the child and hold it, that's accepting the child, or refuse, and that's denying the child. If the child is denied, the child would be abandoned on some dark road, maybe thrown into a forest and left for dead. Usually what would happen is highway robbers would come by and kidnap the child and would raise the child as their own and sell the child into slavery. So fathers have the ultimate authority in whether or not their child is going to be accepted as their own. it rests on the father to discipline and train their child. That is true for the Old Testament. That is true for the New Testament. It is true today. Unfortunately, fathers today do not take up the mantle to discipline their children. They leave it to the school system, the principal, to discipline the child. They leave it up to the youth minister. They leave it up to whatever other authority, the manager or the boss at their place of work, to discipline their children. The reason it is so important for children to obey and honor their parents for the Old Testament was because if they didn't, they would die. Children, I don't know how many children would be listening to this. Well, I suppose all of us are children. If we don't honor our parents, if we don't allow our parents to shape us and discipline us in the way that we should go, something bad's going to happen to us. Something bad. I don't know what constitutes a child here. I could give you the definition of the word for child, for children, and tell you what it means in the Greek context. But I know that several of you will come back and say, well, we're always somebody's child. This is the same argument with elders and deacons, is it not? That an elder must have believing children, and we say, well, what constitutes then as a child? Is it a child that's still within your household? Is it a child that's grown up and gotten married? The words of the proverb writer come into play here. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. That is a proverb. It is not a universal truth. It is inspired Scripture as a proverb, but not as a universal truth. Many of you have tried to raise children who have gone out and have unfortunately left the church. They've left faith or whatever, for whatever reason. I am under the impression, and you can have your own. We can sit down and we can talk and we can study this together, but I am under the impression that when Paul refers to children using this particular word, he is referring to those who are still under the hand of the paterfamilias. Therefore, whoever is in the household as a child under the paterfamilias, which is the oldest living male, that is who this command is given, to whom this command is given. Now, the oldest living man in the first century could be a 95-year-old grandfather who has 3 or 4 generations living in his house, at which point those 3 or 4 generations would need to submit and obey and honor the paterfamilias. In our culture, that really doesn't happen. So I would say that to translate this into our culture, which is a dangerous thing to do, because Paul was writing to a specific context for a specific reason, but if we were to translate this into our own culture, I think it would refer to those children who are still within the family dynamic of the immediate household. So if you are a 30-year-old man living with your parents, this applies to you. If you're a 10-year-old girl living with your parents, this applies to you. And hopefully the time that we were with our parents, we were shaped by this so we can be better groomed, I suppose, for society. One more thing on verse 4. Notice Paul is talking to fathers about discipline. He says, don't provoke your children to anger. In other words, don't discipline them to the point where they are going to resent you. Children don't understand why they're being disciplined most of the time when they are disciplined. So the goal here is to not just be the one who enforces the rod, not just to be the one who gives the punishment, but but Paul says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, let me say this. What this verse tells us is that fathers have a charge to discipline their children. But if we're not disciplining our children in the instruction of the Lord, then we're sadly mistaken. If we are raising our children for who we want them to be, rather than who God wants them to be, we're sadly mistaken. And what we want them to be and what God wants them to be really should be the same thing. Okay, let's move on to bondservants and masters in verse 5. Before we do, let me say this about the context. It has often been said that this passage could be applied today to talk about the Christian employer and the Christian employee. Unfortunately, I don't agree with that. By the way, my Bible, I'm using the term ESV. This translation uses the term bondservant. It's a very politically correct reading of the text. The term here is doulos in Greek, and it means slave. It means one who is utterly subservient to the one that owns you. You are not your own. You have no freedom. You are owned by a human being. Slave and master. Again, we'll talk more about this when we get to Paul's letter to Philemon. Colossians also has something to say about husbands and wives, parents and children, and slaves and masters. So as we read this, just keep in mind, this is not talking about a Christian employer and a Christian employee. This is talking about someone who literally owns another human being as property. We get into a lot of ethical problems here, asking, does God allow us to have slaves? Does God like slavery? Is that something that is biblical or whatever? Again, we'll talk more about that when we get to Paul's letter to Philemon. I think here it's just important to understand that Paul is writing to a specific context the same way I'm talking to a specific context. And things change over time. I think they've changed for the better. But Paul is saying, if you're a Christian and if you have to live in this context, here's how you do it. So let's begin reading in verse 5. And I'm going to change this. Instead of saying bondservant, I'm going to say slave. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. I should say whether he is a slave or is free. Masters, do the same thing to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So let's go back to verse 5. Obey your earthly masters, slaves, with fear and trembling and a sincere heart, just the same way as you would Christ. Now, what Paul is going to say here is the same thing that he's told children, the same thing that he's told wives, the same thing he's told husbands. Your earthly relationships need to resemble the relationship you have with the Lord. And he says in verse 6, don't do it by way of eye service. In other words, don't do it so other people see you doing it and they say, oh, look, what a great slave. And I think that's very applicable to us today. Don't come to church just so people can say, oh, look, what a great Christian. Don't give the homeless man on the corner $5 so people can see you. And this is my biggest pet peeve of the 21st century, is when people record their good deeds. You record what you do, giving money to homeless people, giving food to homeless people. You record it, you post it on social media so everybody can see what good you did. Paul says, don't do it by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as a slave of Christ. Every Christian, Paul says in Romans, in chapter 6, is a slave of Christ. You don't own yourself. And as a matter of fact, it's the great paradox of Christianity. There are two great paradoxes of Christianity. Number one is that you are a slave to Christ, and it is the most liberating and free thing you could ever do. The second is that to become a Christian is a free gift of God that costs you literally everything. Those are the two paradoxes of Christianity. So we are a slave to Christ. We don't own ourselves. We must do the will of God. And that's what Paul says in verse 6 at the very end. Doing the will of God from the heart. And verse 7 continues the thought. Our thought hasn't stopped yet. Rendering service with good will as to the Lord and not to man. So the way I serve other people, especially those who are in authority over me, reflects on God. The way I serve other people should be done the same way I serve God. If you're not serving other people those who are in authority over you in a godly manner, then what does that say about your relationship with the Lord? Now notice in verse 9, he turns the script again. It would be very easy for Paul to write this to slaves, and you can imagine the church meeting in Ephesus or Colossae or wherever, and having this letter read, and the congregation is going to be made up of slaves and free people. And perhaps an elder is reading this letter, and he reads it out loud, and he reads the part about slaves, at which point the whole congregation is going, yep, that's right, you need to submit to me. But then he gets to verse 9, and he says, Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening. A master had the power and authority to deal with his slaves however he wanted. One big issue with Paul's letter to Philemon is that were Philemon a runaway slave, which there are other theories as to who, Onesimus. There are other theories as to who Onesimus is. We'll talk about those when we get there. But were Onesimus a runaway slave, when he comes back, he would be crucified. Yes, crucified. The same way that Jesus died would be the death for a runaway slave. And masters often got their slaves to do certain jobs, to do work, by means of threatening them. In the same way today. Again, I'm not trying to make a correlation between employers and employees, but it makes for a good illustration. The same way today that an employer may come up to you and say, if you don't get this done by 5 o'clock today, you're fired. That's a threat. And it motivates you to do that because you don't want the threat to become reality. He says, Masters, instead of threatening them, treat them the same way you treat Christ. Have a relationship with them the same way you have a relationship with Christ, just as they're going to do that to you. I think when you see Philemon and Onesimus, you see an example of godly men who are able to work in their first century context as Christians. Do you hear me? We have to work as Christians in the context that we're given. That's what we have to do. It's not always easy, but that's what we have to do. We'll stop there, and we will end chapter 6 next week talking about the armor of God. I have thoroughly enjoyed our study of Ephesians. It is likely that we will not be back together by the time we get to our next book to study, which will be Colossians. And I hope that you will like this, that you'll share it on Facebook, let other people see it, and make sure that all of those in our Bible class are seeing it as well. If you haven't liked Coffee and Christ on Facebook yet, please do that. Like the Salem Creek Church of Christ Facebook page as well. We're putting out sermons and Bible classes there every week during this time of quarantine. Lord willing, we'll be back together very soon. God bless you. I hope that you all are able to have a great day.